The Great Basin is my favorite geologic region in the entire U.S. It is a huge endorheic basin that encompasses Oregon, California, Nevada, Utah, and even a part of Mexico. But the first question is, what is an endorheic basin? So an endorheic basin, as shown from this little chart here, is essentially an area where all the waterways within a specific area do not actually flow out into any major world oceans and stay fully contained within the system. So any water that drops in the Great Basin stays in the Great Basin. But then I had another question. How did the Great Basin form? So I started off with a simple Google search saying, how did the Great Basin form? But this yielded answers like, from the crust stretching, and this didn't even have any answers, and this also said the crust stretching, and this one had the right idea, but it was way too wordy. So I decided to ask some local scholars at my local university and see, hey, how did the Great Basin actually form? And this is what I discovered. So our journey starts with the Pacific Oceanic Plate subducting underneath the lighter North American Continental Plate, and originally this subduction is taking place sort of in a southwardly direction, but tens of millions of years ago this direction changed and the Oceanic Pacific Plate decided, hey, I'm going to start going to the north instead of the south. And this directional change caused stress on the overriding plate, which caused this huge fracture zone to occur known as the San Andreas Fault. So now that we have the San Andreas Fault, a lot of things are at play. You have the North American Plate, which is moving southwest, now moving south even more from this fault, and you have the Pacific Plate moving to the north when it used to be moving south. So you have a lot of crust that is somehow getting shifted to the east, and this is causing a lot of crowding in the North American Plate within that region. And as you can imagine, as stuff gets crowded down south and has no place to go, it's going to cause smearing above it in the north to make room for itself, which is causing that crustal extension, which opens the area known as the Great Basin. As this area opens, it's going to create a new fault known as the Walker Lane, which is essentially a response to the drastic forces caused by the San Andreas Fault. So the San Andreas Fault is a right lateral fault, and the Walker Lane is formed from the extension from the Great Basin, which is a left lateral fault. And now we can get into the actual topography of the Great Basin and how that formed. So as crust extends, you are going to get something called normal faults. And normal faults essentially move up and down respective to the land that they cut across. And the land that is going down in this case is called the hanging wall. The land that goes up is called the footwall. So here we have a series of normal faults that line up parallel, and we have their sinking hanging walls and their raised up footwalls, which forms horst and graben topography, or ridge and valley topography, if you'd rather call it that. So in addition to this, we have further uplift from a process called lithospheric delamination. The lithosphere is this huge area of the earth that also encompasses a little bit of the crust, and part of it essentially can snap off, go down into the underlying mantle, cause a bunch of magma upwelling from the mantle, which raises the overlying crust, thus making mountains bigger and valleys bigger. In addition to this, we have a lot of the desert terrain formed from a really extreme rain shadow effect caused by the Sierra Nevadas. So because the Sierras are so big, storms come, they hit the Sierras. As the storms go up the slopes of the Sierras, they condense and cool, which allows them to drop a lot more precipitation, and by the time they get over to the other side, where the Great Basin is, they're basically wrung out like a towel, and they have no more moisture to give, and thus it's very dry, and that's why Nevada is the driest state in the U.S. Now, even though the basin is such a dry place, it doesn't mean that it has a lack of waterways. There's actually quite a few notable ones, including the Sevier River, which spawns out of the mountains of southern Utah, as well as the Truckee River, which has its headwaters in Lake Tahoe on the border of California and Nevada. There's also the Bear River, which is the main major tributary for the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and it spawns from the northern mountains. And there's also the Humboldt River, which is a big drainage river for all of the several little mountains in Nevada. There's also quite a few lakes in the Great Basin, the most notable of which is Lake Tahoe, but there's also several lakes in the Ruby Mountains, as well as the Eastern Sierras, as well as, again, the Ruby Mountains. I just love them so much, I had to point it out twice. And in Great Basin National Park, all these lakes are either a product of being in a higher rainfall part of the state, being at a really high elevation, so they're able to capture a lot of snowmelt, or they have a major tributary creek and or river that feeds up from a higher elevation that sustains their water levels all year round. There's also plenty of waterfalls in the Great Basin, but it goes without saying that the best ones are going to be in the Wasatch Front in Utah and the Sierra Nevadas in Nevada and California. Now let's talk a little bit about the native tribes of the Great Basin. Yes, there were many native tribes in this region who were able to survive the harsh conditions. Starting up first, we have the Goshute, who were native to western Utah and parts of the central part of the Wasatch Front. Next up, we have the Western Shoshone, who were native to eastern Nevada, and they inhabited a lot of the nice mountain ranges in that region. Next, we have the Washoe peoples, who were native to the Lake Tahoe area. And finally, in this little section, we have the Ute, who were native to parts of the Sevier River and parts of the Wasatch Front in Utah, as well as a lot of territory east of that, but the parts in the Great Basin are relegated to that region. Now, I wanted to single out a specific tribe for the sake of this video because of how notable they are in Native American history for the region. And I'm talking about the Northern Paiute that were relegated to a section of northwestern Nevada near Pyramid Lake. So the Paiute were really notable for something called the Ghost Dance, which was a resistance to religious assimilation in the mid to late 1800s, led by religious leaders like Wadziwub and Wolvaka. This was a ceremonial dance that was meant for the promotion of life and prosperity, as well as preaching lasting peace and truthfulness amongst other tribes. And it was said that this dance was able to resurrect fallen natives lost to disease and war, and became a very predominant religious resurrection movement throughout native tribes all throughout the U.S. Another notable thing that the Northern Paiute were involved with was something known as the Pyramid Lake Wars. So essentially you have this new route for white settlers to get through northern Nevada in the mid-1800s known as the Pony Express Trail. And all these new white settlers coming into the region for mining were starting to cause a lot of tension with the local Northern Paiutes. And as this tension built, in 1860, some white settlers decided to harass two native Paiutes, which was a bad decision on their part because it sort of kicked off a little-scale war. So this whole war only included 2 battles, but in one of these battles, a Major William Ormsby of the U.S. Army was killed, and there was also a series of raids that the Paiutes launched towards certain caravans of folks coming across the Pony Express Trail at the time, and this led to quite a few white settlers being killed and not nearly as much Northern Paiutes being killed, but eventually Northern Paiute efforts were ceased and the war came to an end. The most notable European history in the region, other than the settlements of cities like Reno and Salt Lake, was probably the mining that occurred in the Great Basin, specifically for silver. A specific mining lode known as the Comstock lode, which was found near Virginia City in Nevada, was the biggest discovery of silver ore in U.S. history up until that point. Over 7 million tons of ore was pulled out of the ground in this area near Virginia City. And in 1877, one of the most successful years that the mine ever had, over $1 billion in today's money worth of gold and silver was extracted out of the ground. Now, mining in the Great Basin largely continues today. But instead of gold and silver, which are still being extracted, the main focus is lithium. If you didn't know, lithium is widely being used today to produce batteries for electric cars as well as a lot of other electrical appliances, and it is extremely valuable. Right here you're looking at the McDermott caldera, which has an estimated $1.5 trillion worth of the stuff. And as usual, there is a lot of native pushback to mining in the region, but as what usually happens in history, their cries are being overlooked, and the resource is most likely going to be extracted. Now let me briefly touch on some of the hiking in the region. It is absolutely beautiful. You got hiking around Lake Tahoe, you have hiking in all the really beautiful mountains all around Nevada. You have hiking in the Wasatch Front of Utah, which is absolutely stunning. You have hiking in Great Basin National Park, some really cool sweeping views that you can get of a lot of the basin's features. Even hiking in southern Utah is technically part of the Great Basin region, depending on what side of southern Utah you're hiking in. It really is a very beautiful, very diverse region. You have sand dunes. I love dune boarding. If you haven't done it before, I highly recommend doing it. Super fun. You even have stuff all the way down in the deserts of California, like the Anza Borrego and the Mojave Natural Preserve. This right here is a beautiful view of the Wasatch Front and an oasis that you can find in the Anza Borrego Desert. The hiking here is just exquisite, really diverse, really awesome. Lots of really great hikes and really cool off-trail adventures. I highly recommend hiking in the Great Basin region. Thank you so much for watching this video. As always, the links for everything is down below. I just want to remind everybody to get out and hike. And if you like this new style of video, I know is a little different from the ones I've released before, leave me a like and a comment down below. I have more content coming soon.